Good afternoon, I'm Marcela Raggio. I'll be your teacher of American literature in this very unusual term. Instead of meeting in a classroom, I'll send these short videos introducing the texts that we will read as long as we cannot meet in college. I hope you enjoy these texts. The first one is one of the earliest books written in English in America, of Plymouth Plantation, 1620-1647. It's an account that William Bradford, one of the leaders and governor of the pilgrims who arrived in the Mayflower, kept for more than for their contemporaries, for posterity, so that their descendants knew how they had lived over the first years in the new continent. Well, this book was close to me many years ago when I wrote my MA thesis in Latin American and American literature. I compared one of the earliest texts in Latin American writing, La verdadera historia de la conquista de la Nueva España by Bernal Díaz del Castillo, and of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. Even if these texts seem distant from us because of time, in fact, they set the basis of what would later become, in one case, Latin America, in the other case, the United States of America. William Bradford spent 20 years writing this book. He started in 1630 and he finished in 1650. The book covers what happened to the pilgrims between 1620 and 1647. It's not really a chronicle, but a meditation upon an experimenting community. We can say that the pilgrims carried out an experiment in communal living, and at the end came out a little disappointed. In order to know who the pilgrims were, there are several things that I'm sure you studied in history with Professor Bina that will be very helpful now. Probably you remember that in the 16th century, the English church underwent a reformation, and the Anglican church was born. So the church in England that had been Catholic throughout the Middle Ages became the Anglican Church, a Protestant church after the Reformation. The head of state, that is the king or queen, became the head of church as well. But some people believed that that Reformation had not been enough. They wanted to purify the church even more from Catholic influence. So as a nickname, they were called the Puritans. Since, as we have seen, the church and state were closely connected, they were persecuted. So some of these Puritans left England and they settled in the Netherlands, in Holland. The first chapters of Plymouth Plantation speak about that, about how they felt while living in Holland. And eventually they decided to move elsewhere because they were not comfortable in Holland. And, well, they decided to move to the so-called New World. At least it was new for the Europeans. Okay? They set a sort of covenant among themselves, a covenant like the covenant between the Jewish people and God in the Old Testament, and they felt somehow that they were a new chosen people in a new promised land that was America. Of Plymouth Plantation, biblical allusions or biblical parallels are very important because the pilgrims were a very religious people, and so they found in the biblical text many guidelines for their new life in America. Yet Bradford's tone is very ironic because he is wise and he acknowledges in his text the difference, the distance between the divine and human beings. And he is able to depict in his book how imperfect human beings are. His book is written in what later critics called the plain style. Plain or simple style refers to a language that is easy to understand and that at the same time has a sort of rhythm, musicality if you want, based on the repetitions and parallelisms typical of biblical language. So we can see that in this text that is not only a historical source but a literary text, because Bradford paid attention to style, he shows the influence of the Bible that was so relevant to the Puritans. In the edition that I have used, there is a beautiful introduction, very helpful introduction by Francis Murphy. And he closes the introduction with a very interesting phrase. Bradford is the first in a long line of American writers. One thinks immediately of Hawthorne, Henry Adams, Fitzgerald, and Faulkner. By the way, we are going to read works by these authors too, who grasped the imaginative possibilities of the essential American myth. The story of a people who set themselves apart from the rest of the world and pledged themselves to work together in self-sacrifice and love, and who lived to betray that promise by their greed. So this quotation is very poetic somehow, but it tells so much, not only about the Puritans, about Bradford and the Pilgrim Fathers, the people who came with him in the Mayflower, but also about Americans throughout history, okay? And about the American myth, a people who set themselves apart from the rest of the world, who worked together and betrayed the promise they made to themselves by their greed. So think about that over the semester in all the readings and the news and everything that you can connect to American culture and literature. Going back to the style of the book, it's very interesting that Bradford is both the narrator and one of the main characters in his book. Yet, when he speaks about Bradford, the character, he writes in the third person singular. So he, as a narrator, he detaches himself from his own self as a character. Okay? A very interesting case of this is, I'm going to read an example so that you understand what I'm trying to say. In chapter 12, it says, shortly after, William Bradford was chosen governor. By renewed election every year continued sundry years together, which I here note once and for all. So notice how in the same paragraph he speaks of William Bradford as someone else who was elected governor, and then he says, which I, the narrator, here note once and for all. So this is typical throughout the book, okay? You will read that he speaks of William Bradford as if he were someone else. The text explains in detail the covenant, the agreement, okay, that the pilgrims had among themselves, which was at once political and religious, okay? And this is something that has been kept in American culture, even if now it is a secular culture. Okay, remember that the word secular is a word of Latin origin, secula, seculum, okay? Secula is a plural. Seculum is the singular, which meant the century. So whatever is related to the century, to the temporal, is the opposite of the eternal, the religious. Their covenant was at once religious and political, temporal. That is also clearly seen in the text. I have chosen 3 excerpts from the earliest part of the book so that we can read and analyze how these pilgrims set the basis for American culture. Okay, so it's very important that as you read, you detect characteristics such as hard work, self-reliance, cooperation, freedom, okay, that we will find in later texts and also in American society in general. I hope you enjoy the book, the excerpts from the book. We are going to read just some fragments, and we'll keep in touch.